sleep stories for restless minds. Tonight, we invite you to settle into the slow hum of an old engine and the winding quiet of the American backroads. In the long way home, follow two friends and their gangster father on a 1970s road trip through forgotten towns, dusty diners, and the long silences that shape who we become. This is a grounded, nostalgic journey told gently with warmth, memory, and a touch of softness that lingers long after the story ends. Whether you're here to fall asleep or simply drift into a quieter part of yourself, you're in the right place. The summer of 1974 began, for most people, with gas shortages and heat waves. For Theo and Mikey, it began with a knock on the front door and a gravel-rough voice that said, "Grab your stuff, we're heading out." Their bags had been packed for days, not because they knew anything, but because they'd learned to trust that something always happened when Frankie Scardino made an appearance. Frankie was Theo's dad. Mikey had just been absorbed into the family by proximity, like smoke drifting through window screens. He lived next door mostly, ate dinner at their house, often, and never asked questions. Frankie had that effect on people. He wasn't like the fathers in town who sold insurance or fixed Buicks or drank beer behind the garage. He wore rings that clinked against the steering wheel and talked about Nevada like it owed him a favor. His suits were always a little too nice, even when he wasn't going anywhere. He never said he was a gangster, but he didn't have to. That morning, the car was already idling in the driveway when the boys stepped out. It was a long black Lincoln with velvet seats and a silver lighter that still worked. Frankie didn't explain the destination. He never did. He just handed Theo a folded map with one route marked in red and told Mikey to keep his shoes off the dash. Then he pulled out of the neighborhood like it had never mattered at all. They'd been driving for a couple hours before anyone spoke. The windows were down. The heat came in waves. There was a tape playing, something low and dusty, maybe Sam Cooke or Otis Redding, the kind of voice that felt like it belonged to the road itself. Eventually, Mikey said, "So we going anywhere in particular?" Frankie tapped ash into a gold-rimmed tray and replied, "We're going west. That's all you need to know." Theo didn't ask either. He just looked out the window at the passing fields and thought about how different the air smelled when you left the city, like silence had its own scent. Around dusk, they pulled into a gas station that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since Eisenhower. The sign read, "Bill's Stop Last Gas Before Larkspur?" Only there was no Larkspur on the map. Theo checked twice. Mikey wandered toward the vending machine and kicked it, as was tradition. Frankie filled the tank, staring out past the horizon like something he recognized was out there waiting. When they got back in the car, he said nothing. But the map had changed. The red line now veered slightly north, past a scribbled-out town and into a place labeled only Elbridge. Theo blinked. He didn't remember that name from before. But he said nothing. And the car kept going. They reached Elbridge just after midnight. Or maybe it was later. It was the kind of place the headlights couldn't quite hold on to, as if the town had been left in a drawer for too long, its edges faded, its roads unsure of their purpose. There was no official "Welcome to Elbridge" sign. Just an old, rusted billboard with half the letters missing and a peeling ad for a brand of soda that hadn't been stocked in stores for years. Theo leaned forward from the back seat. Did this place used to be something? Frankie didn't answer, but he slowed the Lincoln to a crawl as they passed buildings that looked almost like movie sets, half-gone storefronts, a school with shattered windows, and a diner that still had the paper menus inside. Mikey muttered, "Looks like everybody just walked out one day." Frankie pulled the car to a stop beside a boarded-up gas station. He didn't say they were stopping for the night, but they all understood it. That was the thing about Frankie. He never declared anything, but the air shifted around him like it already knew. The boys set up camp in the car. Seats reclined, windows cracked. The thick summer night buzzing with the sound of insects that hadn't realized the town had been abandoned. Frankie stayed outside. He stood beneath a flickering street lamp, smoking something that smelled too sweet to be from a pack, and looking at the sky like he was waiting for it to confess something. After a long while, he said, not loudly, "Used to be a bank here. Real small. Nothing fancy." Mikey and Theo said nothing. Frankie continued, "Had a vault so old the hinges creaked when you breathed on 'em. Me and a couple guys, back when we were stupid, thought we could take it." He didn't elaborate. Didn't say if they got caught, or if they made off with anything, or what happened to the others. He just said town folded a few years later. I don't know if we helped it fall apart or just showed up in time to see it rot. Theo turned over in the back seat, watching the ceiling as if it might reveal something. Mikey, ever the one to press, asked, "Why come back now?" Frankie tossed the end of his cigarette to the curb. "Sometimes it's good to visit the ghosts, so they don't visit you." Theo woke before sunrise. The sky was soft and gray. The map was on the dashboard again, but something had changed. A small dot unmarked before now had a name. Rinley. Theo traced the red line with his finger. Rinley was further west toward the edge of the map. He didn't remember it being there yesterday. He didn't say anything. He just folded it carefully and placed it back under the dash. By the time Frankie climbed in behind the wheel, the morning was warming. He looked at Theo, then at the road, then said almost kindly, "Let's keep driving." The roads got worse the further west they went. Not in the way people usually meant. Not potholes or gravel or anything mechanical. Just strange. Street signs twisted the wrong direction. Gas stations had pumps but no prices. Trees leaned toward the road like they were listening in. Mikey flipped through the radio for signs of life. Nothing. Just static and snippets of stations that vanished when you leaned in to hear. "Dead zones," Frankie muttered. "Feels like a movie," Mikey said. Theo didn't speak. He was watching the map. The town of Rinley had grown bolder, its name darker, circled now like it wanted to be found. They arrived mid-afternoon. The sun hung low, like it had skipped the part where it should rise overhead. Rinley wasn't abandoned, not exactly, but it looked paused. Houses with curtains still drawn, a gas station with candy still in the window, everything a little too still. They parked by a library that didn't seem to notice time had passed. Frankie didn't get out right away. He stared at the building across the street, an old motel with only one window lit, the rest shuttered like eyelids at dusk. He lit a cigarette, but didn't smoke it. "Used to know someone here," he said. "She ran the desk?" Mikey tilted his head. "Old flame?" Frankie shook his head. "Old something." He stepped out of the car like someone slipping back into a place they never quite left. Theo and Mikey stayed put. Inside the motel's office, a single light glowed through yellowed curtains. Theo leaned forward, watching his dad step inside. The door closed. A long pause. Then the light turned off. "Think we're sleeping here?" Mikey asked. Theo shrugged. They waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Theo got out first. He crossed the street, approached the motel, and placed his hand on the door. It wasn't locked. He stepped inside and found nothing. The room was empty. No Frankie, no woman, no desk. Just dust and a calendar still stuck on August 1967. A breeze moved through the room, but the windows were closed. And on the wall hung a photo. 3 people, blurry and smiling, standing in front of the very same Lincoln. Theo leaned in closer. One of them was Frankie. One looked like the woman behind the motel desk, and the third might have been Theo's age. He didn't recognize him, but he had his eyes. Back at the car, Mikey was asleep. Theo sat behind the wheel for a moment before climbing into the back seat instead. When he glanced at the map, Rinley was gone. Just white space. A space waiting to be replaced. And off to the far edge, a new name was written in faint red ink. Clarendon. They drove through the next morning without music. The tape deck had eaten the cassette sometime during the night, and no one had the heart to fish it out. The road hummed under the tires like it had something to say, but it spoke too softly to be understood. Clarendon wasn't marked by signs. There was just a slow curve in the road, a rusting bridge over a creek that hadn't seen rain in years, and then Suddenly, storefronts. A barber shop, still with the pole turning. A grocery with hand-painted prices in the window. A diner with stools neatly stacked on the counter like they were waiting for opening time that never came. Mikey tapped the window. Think people still live here? Frankie pulled the Lincoln over. Doesn't matter. He got out and crossed the street without looking both ways. Not out of arrogance, but because he knew no one else was coming. Theo and Mikey followed. The town had a weight to it, not heavy, just settled. Like a box in the attic that hadn't been opened in years. But you could still remember what was inside, if you really tried. The diner's door opened easily. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old lemon cleaner. There were menus on every table, each one the same. Chili, pie, coffee for 10 cents. Frankie picked a booth in the back. Theo slid in beside him. Mikey went for the counter and started spinning a stool like a kid waiting for the future to arrive. For a while, no one spoke. Then Frankie said, "Your mom and I came through here once, before you were born." Theo didn't move. Frankie continued, "We weren't running yet. Not really. Just drifting. She liked this place. Said the waitress called her darlin', without sounding like she meant it sarcastically." Theo watched a fly drift lazily across the windowsill. "I used to think I could bring her back to places like this," Frankie said. "Like time would wait for me if I asked nicely." He looked around. But it doesn't. Outside, a breeze stirred the trees, and down the street, a dog barked once, then stopped, like even it wasn't sure it had the right to speak in a place like this. They stayed in Clarendon until sunset. Didn't do much, just existed. Frankie walked the sidewalk like he'd walked it before. Theo sat on the diner steps and watched the sky melt into red. Mikey found an old jukebox in the corner and got it to play a warbly version of Crimson and Clover. And when it was time to go, no one said it out loud. They just got in the car, one by one, and waited for the headlights to carve the path. Theo checked the map again. Clarendon was fading already. And a new name, barely visible, was appearing across the fold. Vesper Hollow. They arrived at Vesper Hollow under a sky the color of old postcards, muted blue, just beginning to fray at the edges. The Lincoln's tires crunched over gravel that hadn't been touched in years, save for the occasional wandering deer or someone with a reason too quiet to share. There was no town square, no welcome sign. Just a bend in the road where the trees gave way to cracked sidewalks, scattered mailboxes, and houses that didn't look broken, just paused. Frankie stopped the car in front of what had once been a small movie theater. The marquee above the doors still read, "Showing tonight It's a Wonderful Life." Mikey leaned forward. "What is this, a ghost town film club?" Frankie smiled faintly. "We hid here once. Long time ago. It was a place you could disappear without asking permission." He got out of the car. Theo followed, less out of curiosity than out of quiet habit. They crossed the street and stepped through the glass doors of the theater, which creaked open without resistance. Inside, the air was cool and soft, like being inside someone's forgotten dream. Dust floated through the projector beam like falling stars. The rows of seats sat perfectly still, some with coats still draped over the backrests, as if their owners had just stepped out for popcorn and never came back. Frankie stood in the aisle, unmoving. Mikey called out from the balcony, "Place gives me the creeps." Frankie turned slowly. Places like this aren't haunted. They're patient. Theo sat in the front row. He didn't know what he was waiting for. But then, the projector clicked on. No one had touched it. And on the screen came not a movie, but home video, grainy, soft-edged. Theo saw a child's birthday party in someone's backyard, a picnic table, balloons, a woman laughing, a man holding a camera. Then, a moment of static. And a new image, the Lincoln, parked under a different sky. 3 people standing beside it. One of them clearly Frankie, one maybe Theo, and the third... Theo couldn't look away. It was a man with a familiar shape, but a face he didn't know. Not in memory, but in feeling. He turned to ask Frankie about it, but his father was gone. Not outside, Not behind him. Just gone. Mikey came down from the balcony, eyes wide. "Did you see the film too?" he asked. Theo nodded slowly. Mikey looked toward the empty screen, then said quietly, "I don't think we're following the map anymore." Theo unfolded it. Vesper Hollow was already gone. In its place was nothing. Just white. No next town. No red line. No destination. Just stillness. And in the bottom corner, a new note had appeared in shaky handwriting. "Last stop Dyer's Ridge." They didn't speak much on the way to Dyer's Ridge. The radio refused to work, the sky stayed gray, and even Mikey, who usually filled the silence with jokes or nonsense, just leaned against the window and watched the world slip by. Frankie drove like he wasn't chasing anything anymore. Like the road had become a hallway in a house he used to live in, familiar in the bones, but different with every step. Theo sat in the back seat, map folded in his lap. There were no more towns marked. Only Dyer's Ridge. Written like the end of a sentence. The town sat high in the hills. Not elevated exactly, just separate. The air changed as they climbed. Cooler, quieter, the kind of quiet you can feel in your ears. Dyer's Ridge looked lived in, but not alive. Porch swings moved gently, though there was no breeze. A few lights glowed in windows, but there were no people. Just the sense that people had been here, had wanted to stay, and something, nothing violent, just inevitable, had told them it was time to leave. Frankie parked at the edge of a gravel loop near the top of the ridge. Beyond it, the land sloped down into endless pine. "We'll rest here," he said. And no one argued. That night, Theo couldn't sleep. He left the car and walked a little way into the field beyond the ridge, the crunch of dry grass beneath his shoes the only sound in the world. He sat down beneath a half-dead oak and unfolded the map again. It had changed. The red line was gone. Only the paper's soft creases and faint coffee stains remained. But in the center of the page, a new note had appeared, written not in ink, but in pressure, like someone had traced it from the other side. "What you've been looking for isn't on the map." He stared at it for a long time, then folded it, pocketed it, and looked out across the dark tree line. Back at the car, Mikey was asleep. Frankie sat on the hood, smoking a thin cigar and looking up at the stars, like he was waiting for one to fall and grant him a second chance. Theo sat beside him without speaking. After a while, Frankie asked, "You think it was all a waste?" Theo looked down at his shoes. "No, but I think we were always going to end up here." Frankie smiled, just slightly, then whispered, "Good." The next morning came slow. Not with light, but with stillness. Theo was the first to wake. The car steamed slightly with dew. The windshield blurred the outside world like memory always does, close but never sharp. Frankie was gone again. Not like before, not vanished, just up already. Theo found him sitting on the ridge, arms resting over his knees, watching the horizon like he'd misplaced something in it. Mikey sat on the hood of the car, sipping from a warm bottle of orange soda they'd picked up back in Clarendon. He didn't ask where they were headed next. None of them did, because they already knew. There was nowhere else to go. They walked the ridge together. Not far, just enough to see the edge of it, where the land dropped off into a deep bowl of trees and shadow, and far below, a flicker of water. Frankie pointed. "That lake used to be full," he said. "Whole town came here in July. Fireworks, lemonade stands. You could smell charcoal and chlorine in the air." Mikey said, "Doesn't sound like you." Frankie shrugged. "That's the thing about ghosts. Sometimes they come from lives you almost had." Theo sat on a sun-bleached picnic bench that had been overtaken by weeds. There was no wind, no insect. Even the birds had gone silent. It felt like the kind of place the world forgot to finish. Later, as the day wore down, they wandered back to the Lincoln. Frankie opened the trunk, not for anything dramatic, just a cooler. He handed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, ham and cheese, a slice of pickle in each. Theo unwrapped his, slowly unsure why it felt like ceremony. Frankie sat on the bumper. "This is where I came after everything went sideways," he said. "Not because it was safe, but because it was quiet." Mikey nodded. Theo didn't. He was staring at the dash where the map had been left. It was blank now. Not white. Not clean. Just soft gray paper with no more need to direct. That night they didn't sleep in the car. They spread out blankets beneath the stars. Theo stared upward, listening to the air between the trees. Mikey mumbled something about starting a band, then trailed off. Frankie lit one last cigar and said, "You boys were good to come." Neither of them replied, because there wasn't anything left to say. And that was okay. Sometimes the most peaceful part of a road trip is the stop where no one talks. The sun came up pale, as if unsure whether to rise at all. Theo blinked into the soft light, blanket still around his shoulders, breath visible in the cool morning air. It smelled like pine and old embers, the kind of scent you don't forget even when you try. Mikey was already awake, walking the edge of the ridge barefoot, arms spread like wings. Frankie was sitting with his back to the tree line, staring into a black notebook. Theo had seen the notebook before, once, years ago, peeking out of the glove box like it had its own quiet weight. Frankie never wrote in it in front of anyone. But this morning he didn't hide it. He just turned the page slowly and wrote something down, careful and small. When Theo approached, Frankie didn't look up. "Just names," he said softly. "Places, people, things I might have forgotten if I don't put 'em down." Theo didn't ask what he'd written, but he wondered if his name was there. By noon they were on the move again. Not with purpose, just with rhythm. The Lincoln hummed down an unnamed road that wasn't on any map, through trees that felt closer than they should have been, like the forest had quietly shifted in the night. They passed a gas station shaped like a barn, boarded up but with one window open. Inside, a wind chime made of bones clinked in the still air. No one stopped. The air didn't ask them to. Sometime mid-afternoon, they found a radio station again. It wasn't music, not at first, just a voice, low crackling. "And if you're out there heading west, I hope the road's been kind. I hope you've made peace with the quiet. And I hope you remember to stop once in a while and listen." Theo turned the knob, but it only led to static. The voice was gone, but it had felt like it had known them. That night, Frankie finally let them into the story. They'd made camp on the edge of a dry lake, the stars smeared across the sky like someone had exhaled light. He passed the notebook to Theo. "Pick a page," he said. Theo flipped it open at random. He read, January 12th, 1966, Reno, Cafe on Maple. Kid with a blue hat, never asked for anything, just stared at my rings like they meant something. Another page. July 3rd, 1970, south of Larkspur. Watched fireworks alone, thought about calling her, didn't. And another, June 11th, 1974. This one matters. Took the boys, didn't tell them why. Maybe it doesn't matter, but I think this is the last ride. Theo closed the book. Frankie didn't ask what he thought. Mikey just said, "You always knew where this was going, didn't you?" Frankie looked at the stars and replied, "Doesn't mean I was ready." They came upon it just after sunrise. No fanfare, no sign, just a town that looked like it had shed its own name and curled into itself like something too tired to be known anymore. 3 streets, 1 stoplight blinking yellow for no one, a bar with half a neon sign still glowing, a motel where the front desk sat behind dusty glass, a post office with its door wide open but no letters on the floor. Mikey stared out the window. "What is this place?" Frankie said nothing. Theo unfolded the map again, not expecting answers, just a habit. There was nothing where they were, not even a dot. But in the corner, someone had scribbled in pencil, "Some towns remember you." They parked by the bar. Frankie got out first and pushed open the door, the bell above ringing like it was trying to wake a ghost. Inside, the air was warm and dry, The place looked clean but untouched, like someone had closed it for the weekend in 1963 and never came back. 3 bar stools, 1 cracked mirror, a jukebox with selections handwritten in blue ink. Frankie walked to the jukebox and pressed a button. A soft hum began, followed by a song Theo had never heard before, slow, piano-heavy, and full of spaces where lyrics should be. Mikey lit a candle from a table and held it like a torch, even though the room didn't need light. Theo wandered toward the back, where a hallway led to rooms that might have been used once. Rooms full of dust, coat hangers, and glasses of water left untouched. In the last room, there was a cot. And a photo on the wall. It was them. Not exactly, but close. 3 men, same posture, same kind of Lincoln parked in the corner of the frame, a road behind them that vanished into fog. Theo stared at it for a long time. When he turned back to the hallway, he wasn't sure if he'd taken the photo off the wall or if it had never been there at all. They left just after noon. No one said goodbye to the town. But it felt like the town said goodbye to them. A breeze swept through the street as they passed the stoplight, and the light turned red for a full minute, though no other cars passed. Theo watched the town shrink in the rear view. And for the first time he whispered to himself, "We're almost done." Frankie heard it and didn't correct him. The car was quieter now. Not just because no one was speaking, but because the road itself had changed. Softer beneath the tires, less paved, more suggestion, like even the land wasn't sure if they were supposed to keep going. They didn't use the map anymore. Not because it was gone, but because it had stopped showing anything. Instead, Frankie drove by memory. Not the kind you keep in your head, but the kind your bones remember. The way your body knows a scent or how light falls in late afternoon. They stopped for lunch in a field full of lavender. No reason. Just a turnoff, a clearing, a soft breeze. Frankie sat on a blanket and peeled an orange. Mikey laid flat on the grass, hat pulled over his eyes. Theo wandered a bit, hands in his jacket pockets, breathing in the scent of something old and gentle. When he came back, Frankie handed him a slice of orange. It was sweeter than he expected. "You remember this place?" Theo asked. Frankie nodded slowly. "This was the first place I came after I found out about you." Theo looked at him. Frankie didn't break the gaze. "Your mom, she wasn't sure at first. Neither was I. But then I sat here and thought, maybe this is what it looks like to stay." Theo didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out at the field and whispered, "Why didn't you?" Frankie's voice was soft. "Didn't know how. They stayed longer than they meant to. The sun fell slower here, as if it knew they weren't in a hurry. At some point, Mikey said, we could just stop here." Frankie said we could. But he didn't. They got back in the car as the light dimmed, the lavender fields falling away behind them like the last scene in a forgotten movie. Theo sat in the front seat now. Not because they asked him to switch, but because it felt right. The road ahead curved, dipped, and rose like it was breathing. And as they drove, no one asked where they were going. Because somehow they all knew. The road dipped into a stretch of forest that looked familiar, though none of them had seen it before. The trees here weren't like the others. These were tall and lean, their branches interlocked above like hands shielding them from the sky. Sunlight filtered through in soft streaks, like it had something sacred to say but didn't want to speak too loudly. Mikey cracked his window, letting in the scent of pine, damp soil, and something older, smoke, maybe, or cedar. "This feel familiar to anyone else?" he asked. Theo nodded slowly. Frankie didn't respond. But his grip on the wheel softened. They reached a clearing. Not marked, not planned, just there. A wide circle of flat grass, a rusted fire ring, logs placed in a triangle around it like an old campsite no one had used since before they were born. Frankie pulled over and turned off the engine. He didn't say we're staying. They just stayed. Mikey got out first, stretching, yawning, grabbing his guitar from the back. He strummed it once, not to play, just to check if it still remembered how to sound. Theo walked toward the far edge of the clearing where a small wooden sign leaned against a tree. There were no words on it anymore, just the faint trace of a name, long erased by wind and time. That night, they built a fire. Frankie stacked the wood with the care of someone who had once relied on it. Theo lit it with a single match. The fire caught easily, as if it had been waiting. Mikey played a few slow chords, voice low and unpolished. It wasn't a performance, just something to hold the dark back a little longer. After a while, Frankie said, "I came here once, before I met either of you. Thought I'd found the edge of the world." Theo looked up. "And what did you find?" Frankie smiled a little sad. "A place where I didn't have to be anything for a while." They sat quiet after that. Not awkward, just resting in the stillness. Like maybe that was all they needed now. When the fire burned low, Frankie stood and walked a slow circle around the edge of the clearing. He touched one of the trees, closed his eyes, then turned to the boys and said, "If this is where the road ends, I'm okay with it." Lap. The fire had dimmed to a low orange glow, just enough to warm the air between them. Frankie sat cross-legged now, hands resting on his knees like he'd done this 1,000 times in lives no one wrote down. Mikey lay back in the grass, head on his jacket, watching sparks drift toward the canopy like miniature stars. Theo held the map in his lap. It had no marks anymore. No lines. No names. But it didn't feel empty. It felt finished. He didn't say anything. He just folded it one last time and tucked it under the seat when they turned in for the night. Sometime near dawn, a light rain began to fall. Not a storm, just a quiet, misty kind of rain that softened the world without asking for attention. Theo woke to it and stepped out of the car, barefoot on wet leaves. He didn't know what time it was, only that it wasn't time to go yet. He wandered the perimeter of the clearing, tracing the path Frankie had walked the night before. He found a tree with initials carved deep into the bark. 3 letters. He ran his fingers over them. They weren't his, but they felt like they could have been. When he returned to the fire ring, Frankie was already there. No cigar? No notebook. Just sitting, hands in his lap. "Dream anything?" Theo asked. Frankie shook his head. No dreams left, just remembering. He looked at Theo with eyes that were softer than they'd been all trip. "You boys remind me of how things could have gone." Theo didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence fits better than words. They left a few hours later. Didn't pack much, there wasn't much to pack. The car started on the first try. The road out was narrower than it had been coming in, as if the clearing was gently releasing them, but only because it had to. Mikey leaned out the window as they drove off. He whispered thanks to no one in particular. And the trees somehow didn't feel empty at all. By midday, the road had become unfamiliar again. Not in the strange way, no eerie towns, no flickering signs, just blank. Long stretches of nothing but golden fields, scattered clouds, and the sound of rubber humming across sun-warmed asphalt. Theo sat up front again. Mikey was asleep in the back, a baseball cap covering his face, legs bent awkwardly against the window. Frankie didn't say much. He just drove. Like the car knew where to go, even if none of them did. They passed a town without stopping. No need. It looked too new, too ordinary, like something built for someone else's story. Neon signs, gas pumps that worked, people waiting at crosswalks. Theo watched it go by. He didn't miss it. Frankie noticed. "Not ours," he said. Theo nodded. That was enough. Later, they pulled into a turnout by a narrow creek. It wasn't marked on anything, but Frankie remembered it. Said it used to be full of fish and sunbathers. Now it just looked like memory without the echo. They sat by the water and let it run past their fingers. It was cold. Alive in a way nothing else had been for days. Theo took off his shoes and stepped in, wading to the middle where the stones were smooth and flat. He didn't say anything dramatic, just breathed. and let the water tug at him like it wanted to remember his shape. Back on the road, Mikey finally asked, "What happens when we get there?" Frankie didn't answer right away, then said, "That depends on what you think there is." Theo looked out the window, trees beginning to thin into scrubby hills. "I don't think we're looking for a place anymore," he said. Mikey nodded. "Yeah, I was starting to wonder if we ever were." Frankie smiled faintly and drove on. As the sun lowered behind them, the Lincoln passed an old wooden sign too faded to read. But someone had carved something beneath it, fresh and deliberate. A message. "If you made it here, you already know." Theo smiled. And for the first time in miles, so did Frankie. They didn't speak much that evening. The road wound gently through low hills, the horizon glowing soft amber, as if the world had dimmed the light just for them. Frankie drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the window, elbow out like it was still 1959 and he had somewhere to be. Mikey hummed a half-remembered tune in the back seat. Theo stared straight ahead, eyes not on the road but on something deeper, some thought just out of reach, like a name you can't quite place. They passed a farmhouse with its windows lit. A dog barked once, then quieted. There were clothes on a line, unmoving, as if the wind had grown tired of telling stories. Theo watched it disappear behind them. "Think that was real?" he asked. Frankie didn't look over. "Maybe." Mikey said, "Or maybe we're the ones that aren't." Nobody laughed. Not because it was sad, but because it didn't need to be. They stopped on the side of the road as the last light slipped behind the hills. No destination, just stillness. Frankie opened the trunk and pulled out 3 lawn chairs, old metal ones with cracked plastic webbing. They sat together facing west. Not talking, just watching the sky change. Birds passed overhead, moving in loose formation, like they too were headed somewhere just out of reach. Theo leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath him. "I think we're close," he said. Frankie nodded once, but didn't ask, "To what?" Mikey leaned forward, elbows on knees. "If this is the end," he said, "it's not so bad." Frankie took a slow breath. "It's not the end. It's just where the story stops needing to be told." Theo glanced at him. "Is there a difference?" Frankie didn't answer. Instead, he took out the notebook again. He didn't open it, just held it, then handed it to Theo. "Your turn." Theo took it gently, held it in his lap. Didn't open it yet, but he would. Later. The stars came out one by one, and the night asked nothing of them, just to be there, together. Quiet. They woke to bird song and the warmth of morning sun cutting through the windshield. Theo sat up in his lawn chair, blinking away sleep. Mikey was curled in his, one leg dangling off the side like a sleepy kid after a parade. Frankie was already awake, sitting still in the driver's seat, key in the ignition but engine silent. "You ready?" he asked quietly, not looking back. Neither of the boys answered. But they got in. Not because they needed to go, but because the car did. They drove for a while in silence. Then Frankie turned off the paved road onto a dirt path with no signs, no markers, no name. It led through a cluster of tall pines, down a soft hill, and into an open field lined with weather-worn fence posts. Beyond that was a cabin, small, square, unpainted, the kind that doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. Frankie parked and turned off the engine. Nobody moved. Finally, Theo asked, "What is this place?" Frankie looked ahead, then said, "This is where I left the other version of me." They unpacked slowly. There wasn't much. Just blankets, a cooler, the notebook. No one talked about going back. They didn't need to. Mikey explored the edge of the woods and found an old rope swing tied to a limb. He didn't use it, just stood there for a while, holding it. Theo wandered down to a small stream, stepping over fallen branches, listening to the soft rush of water on stone. Frankie stayed by the car for a long time before walking down the path and standing on the cabin's porch. He didn't open the door, just leaned against the frame and breathed in deep. That night, they built one last fire. The stars overhead blinked like slow thoughts. Theo finally opened the notebook. He turned to the last page, blank. Mikey asked, "What are you going to write?" Theo stared at the paper, then slowly wrote, "We made it." He passed the notebook to Frankie. Frankie read the words, closed the book, and didn't need to add anything. They didn't sleep in the car that night, or in the cabin. They slept on the porch, under blankets beside each other, like people who had stopped running. And far off on some forgotten stretch of road, the Lincoln sat alone in the field. Quiet, rest. The morning came slow. It didn't announce itself with a rooster crow or a bright burst of color, just the steady warming of air, the smell of pine and soil, and the hush that only comes when nothing needs your attention. Theo was the first to stir, wrapped in his blanket, the wooden porch creaking slightly beneath him. He didn't move at first, just listened. Bird song, the drip of dew from the eaves, the faint breeze through the trees. And somewhere behind it all, a stillness. Not emptiness, just something settled. Frankie sat inside the cabin. The door was half open, and the light from the window cut across the floor like an old photograph. He was at the table, the notebook beside him, untouched. A cup of black coffee steamed next to it. No sugar, no cream, just the way he always drank it. Theo stepped inside without knocking. Frankie didn't look up. "You ever think about staying here?" Theo asked, voice still groggy with sleep. Frankie sipped. "I think about staying everywhere." Theo smiled faintly. "Why didn't you?" Frankie finally looked at him. "Because I hadn't finished driving yet." Mikey appeared in the doorway not long after, holding a branch like a walking stick and wearing a flannel shirt he must have found inside. "Place smells like an old man's sock drawer," he muttered. Frankie laughed once, just a breath through his nose. Mikey walked to the far wall, where a faded map hung in a crooked frame. Most of the towns they'd passed weren't on it. A few were. One near the edge was circled in red ink. Mikey pointed to it. "What's this one?" Frankie's gaze drifted to the map. "That's where I left my name," he said. They spent the rest of the day repairing the porch railing. Not because they needed to, just because it felt like the kind of thing a person ought to do when they stop moving. Theo held the boards. Mikey hammered. Frankie supervised, occasionally making sarcastic remarks about how neither of them would survive an hour in real construction. It felt ordinary, but in the kind of way that makes you realize how rare ordinary really is. That evening, they lit a fire in the stone pit behind the cabin. No stories, no songs, just the sound of wood cracking, the sky turning indigo, and 3 men who'd finally run out of places to be. The cabin had a drawer no one had opened. Not because it was locked, just forgotten. The kind of drawer that blends into the wood grain, content to wait. Theo found it on a quiet afternoon while looking for a pencil. He tugged it open and found a single envelope inside. Yellowed unsealed. No stamp. Just a name. Frankie. He held it in his hand for a long moment before setting it on the table beside the coffee cup. Frankie hadn't touched that morning. When Frankie came in from chopping wood, he saw it. He didn't speak right away, just stared. Then, with a tired breath, he sat down. Theo didn't ask who wrote it. He already knew. Frankie opened the envelope carefully like it might fall apart. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creases worn smooth by time. He didn't read it out loud. Didn't need to. His jaw set. His shoulders shifted. And when he finally folded it and placed it back in the drawer, he said only, "She wrote it the night before I left." Theo nodded, silent. Mikey stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes not quite meeting theirs. Frankie leaned back in the chair. "She said she understood why I had to go. Said she hoped I'd bring the boys back someday." Theo looked up. "The boys?" Frankie's eyes met his. Yeah. That evening, they walked down the trail behind the cabin. It led to a ridge overlooking a deep valley. The air was crisp, the hills bruised with shadow and light. They stood there for a long time. Not for answers. Just to be still in it. Theo glanced at Frankie, who hadn't stopped watching the trees. Did she know I'd be here? Frankie smiled faintly. She hoped. That was enough. Mikey sat on a rock and began to hum. Soft, slow. It was a tune Theo remembered from somewhere, though he couldn't name it. Maybe it was just something Mikey made up. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting. That night, as the fire burned low, Frankie reached for the notebook again. He didn't write in it, just flipped to the letter and slid it between the pages. Theo watched him. Is that where it belongs? Frankie looked at him. No, he said softly. But it's where it'll stay. The days started blending. Not in a dull way, but like brushstrokes on an old canvas, where no one line can be seen apart from the rest. They woke when the sun said to, ate when the birds got quiet, and slept when the stars blinked on like porch lights. No one spoke of leaving. No one said the word home. And the map, the one Theo used to keep folded by his side, was now just another scrap of paper pinned to the cabin wall, next to an old grocery list and a faded recipe for chili. On the third morning, Mikey made breakfast. He cooked eggs on a rusted camping skillet balanced over the fire pit. No one asked where he'd found them. They didn't taste like any eggs Theo had ever had, but they were warm, and that was enough. Frankie took his coffee black, as always, and said nothing. But his eyes watched them differently now, softer, like he wasn't keeping guard anymore, just keeping time. After breakfast, Theo wandered into the woods. He didn't mean to go far. But the trail curved gently, and the sun dappled the forest floor just right, and soon he found himself in a clearing he didn't recognize. There was a small bench, stone, moss growing along its side like a scarf tucked in for winter. On the bench sat a single coin. Not new, not old, just placed. Theo picked it up, turned it over, one side blank. The other bore the faint outline of a compass rose, worn down almost smooth. No letters, no directions, just suggestion. He pocketed it and sat down. The woods didn't feel empty. They felt patient. When he returned, Mikey was drawing on the back of the grocery list. Not a real drawing, just lines and curves, circles. Theo asked, "What is it?" Mikey shrugged. Might be the cabin, might be us. Might be the way this place fits into the rest of the world. Theo sat beside him and watched. Frankie was on the porch, boots off, head tilted back. He looked like a man who hadn't felt tired in a long time. Not because he'd rested, but because he'd finally stopped needing to prove something. That night it rained. Harder than before. But the cabin held, and so did they. It rained through the morning. Not a quick passing shower, a soaker. Steady, silver and slow, the kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind that cleans without warning. The three of them stayed inside the cabin, windows fogged, the wood stove humming a low breath that filled the air with pine smoke and something that smelled almost like memory. Mikey sat on the floor sorting cards, an old deck he'd found in the drawer beneath the silverware. They were stained and curled, but still playable. Theo leaned by the window, staring at the rippling puddles on the porch. Frankie sat at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped green mug. Up. No one had spoken yet, but it didn't feel like silence. It felt like peace. At some point, Mikey dealt a hand to each of them. They played slowly. Not to win, just to do something with their hands. Frankie told a story about a guy he used to run with back in Detroit, a man who once bet a Cadillac on a hand of gin rummy and lost. Theo raised an eyebrow. "Did you win the car?" Frankie smiled. "I wasn't playing." Mikey chuckled. "You steal it afterward?" Frankie sipped his coffee and didn't answer. Which told them everything. The rain didn't let up. By afternoon, the dirt path outside had turned to soft, sinking mud. The car looked lonely under its tarp, wheels deep in earth like it had grown roots. Mikey said, "We might not get out of here." Theo said, "Maybe we're not supposed to." Frankie said nothing, just looked toward the woods. That evening the fire was smaller than usual. Not weak, just thoughtful. They cooked dinner in a dented saucepan and ate in their laps, backs against the cabin wall, knees drawn up, steam rising from their bowls like ghosts with nowhere else to go. Theo pulled the coin from his pocket and turned it over in the firelight. Still blank. Still certain. Mikey leaned close. "You keeping that?" Theo nodded. "Feels like it found me." Frankie looked down at the coin. Then at Theo. It did. And for the first time in days, he opened the notebook again. He wrote something quick, just one sentence. Then closed it, slid it under the cot, and went to sleep. The rain stopped sometime during the night. Theo woke to the hush that follows a storm, the kind of quiet that feels like the world taking a breath. The cabin smelled of damp wood and cooled ash. Light pushed gently through the curtains, gold and wide, like the morning had been waiting just behind the clouds. Mikey was still asleep on the floor, curled under 2 blankets. Frankie was gone. Theo stepped outside, boots squelching slightly in the soft ground. The trees dripped. The air was still but heavy with the scent of cedar and earth. He found Frankie down by the stream, crouched at the edge, hands dipped in the cold water. He didn't look up, just said, "It's almost time." Theo stood beside him, arms folded. "Time for what?" Frankie straightened slowly, eyes on the slow-moving current. "For the road to call us again." Back at the cabin, Mikey had woken and was pouring the last of the coffee grounds into the old percolator. "Thought we were staying," he said, rubbing his eyes. Frankie stepped in, shoulders damp. "Thought we might be," he answered, "but the weather's cleared, and there's one more stop." Theo looked up. "Where?" Frankie didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the wall where the faded map hung and tapped the corner. There, in that same red ink, was the circled town again. No name, just a mark. Mikey frowned. "Didn't we already pass that?" Frankie's eyes were calm. "We passed near it, but we weren't ready yet." Theo nodded slowly. They all understood what he meant. They packed without hurry. Not because they weren't eager, but because they knew this wasn't the kind of leaving you rush. Blankets folded, mug rinsed. Notebook tucked into the glove box. Theo placed the coin on the cabin's windowsill. Mikey set the deck of cards beside it. And Frankie, without ceremony, walked to the car and peeled back the tarp. The Lincoln still gleamed. Dusty, rusted around the wheel wells. But ready. They didn't speak when they got in. The tires turned slowly, lifting from the earth like the roots had been loosened. And the road, like a patient old friend, stretched out in front of them once more. They drove for hours without seeing another soul. The road narrowed again, not in size but in clarity. Pavement cracked, then disappeared. Gravel took its place. Dirt, then something between trail and memory. The world on either side turned amber. Tall grass waved like it had something to say but couldn't find the words. Theo rolled the window down. The wind felt different now. Not just air, but change. Frankie slowed the car at an old railway crossing. There were no lights. No gate. Just 2 rusted rails and a weather-beaten sign that read, "Look twice." He stopped. Not because of a train, but because the air demanded it. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Frankie said, "I came through here once, on my way to fix something I'd broken." Mikey asked, "Did you fix it?" Frankie looked at the tracks. "I don't know." Theo watched him carefully. "Was it her?" Frankie shook his head slowly. "It was me." They crossed the tracks and entered a landscape that felt paused. Fewer trees, longer shadows. The horizon opened like a mouth waiting to speak. The Lincoln rattled a little on the dirt but held steady. It was a car that knew how to keep secrets. Mikey leaned forward from the back seat. Anyone else feel like we're not going somewhere new? Theo nodded. Feels like we're finishing a sentence. Frankie grinned at that, or underlining it. They saw the sign just before dusk. It was made of driftwood nailed into 2 crooked posts, hand-painted in chipped white letters, Bellbrook. No population listed. No welcome. Just a name that felt familiar in a way that made the back of Theo's neck prickle. Frankie exhaled deeply. This is it. Mikey asked, "What's here?" Frankie put the car in park and turned off the ignition. "The place I never took your mother?" They stepped out of the car and stood by the edge of the field. In the distance, at the foot of the hill, stood the outline of a house. Small. Still. Waiting. The grass was tall along the path. It brushed their legs as they walked, slow, quiet, careful not to break the silence that hovered like fog. The house at the bottom of the hill wasn't abandoned exactly. It was preserved by absence. The kind of place where time didn't move forward, it simply waited. White paint peeled gently from the siding. A wooden rocking chair sat motionless on the porch. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, but there was no wind. Just breath. Frankie stopped at the gate and ran his hand over the top rail. His fingers caught on a carved initial. It wasn't his, but he lingered anyway. Theo stood beside him. Mikey hung back, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders tucked up, like the quiet had started to settle inside him. Frankie said softly, "I came here once. She told me not to." Theo asked, "Did she know you came?" Frankie smiled. "She knew everything." They walked up to the porch together. The boards creaked underfoot but didn't protest. Frankie opened the screen door, then paused. He didn't knock. Didn't need to. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was dry and still. Furniture covered with sheets. A coat rack stood by the door, holding a single hat. Mikey took it off the hook. It was small, worn. He held it in his hands for a long moment before setting it back gently. Theo walked into the front room and stood beneath a faded photo of a woman in a field of flowers. He didn't know her, but she looked like someone who would have made room at the table for 3 strangers if they were polite and hungry. Frankie stood in the kitchen doorway. "She was going to take me here," he said. "When I got clean, when I was ready." Theo turned. "Were you?" Frankie shook his head. "But I am now." They stayed until the sun began to fall behind the trees. No one spoke of what came next. No one needed to. Frankie took the notebook from his coat and opened it on the kitchen table. There was only 1 page left. Mikey found a pencil in the drawer. And together without words, they wrote a sentence. Not to be read. Just to be left behind. That night they didn't drive. They walked the field, sat on the porch, and watched the sky fade to blue, then violet, then the soft black that holds sleep like a lullaby. The house had no electricity, but it didn't matter. They lit candles, not many, just enough to make shadows flicker against the walls, long and slow like memories passing by. Theo set his blanket down in what was once a living room. Mikey took the far corner beneath the window. Frankie sat at the kitchen table for a long time, long after the others had settled, watching the candle flame like it was the only thing left he needed to understand. Outside, the wind picked up. Not sharp. Not angry. Just enough to move the chimes. They sang like soft glass laughter. Not cheerful. Just gentle. Theo couldn't sleep at first. His mind wandered, not racing, just drifting, through every turn in the road, every song Mikey hummed, every look Frankie gave that said more than he ever let slip aloud. He stared at the ceiling beams and thought, maybe we were supposed to end up here the whole time. He didn't say it. He didn't need to. Mikey was already snoring softly. Not the kind that meant discomfort, just the sound of a body finally safe enough to rest. Frankie stepped in from the porch and looked at the two of them for a long moment before blowing out the last candle. The room settled into darkness. Warm, still. That night no one dreamed. Not because they were too tired, but because they were already inside one. In the morning, the sun came in slow stripes through the dusty windows. Theo stirred, stretched, and sat up. He looked around the room, quiet but certain. Frankie was gone, but not far. He found him out back, behind the house, staring at an overgrown garden. Tomato cages bent with age. A few stubborn vines clung to the wire, green even now. Frankie said she used to talk about canning. Said if we ever made it here, we'd spend the whole summer putting up jars of pickles and beans. Theo smiled. I'd have liked that. Frankie nodded once, then whispered, so would I. They didn't say goodbye to the house. They just left the door open, so the wind could come in, and maybe memory too. They didn't speak for the first 10 miles. The Lincoln rolled easy over the gravel, tires humming like a slow lullaby. The trees thinned, the hills softened, and sunlight spilled in warm streaks through the windshield. Mikey finally said that place felt like a secret we weren't supposed to find. Frankie, hands on the wheel, nodded. Maybe it was. Theo leaned his head against the window. Maybe it was waiting for us. They passed an old diner sign bent backward by wind. The building itself was long gone, just the concrete pad, a few weeds pushing through. Frankie slowed, pulled off, and parked. Not to stop for food, just to be still. They sat on the hood of the car, sharing a dented can of peaches they found in the back. No forks, just pocket knives. The syrup sticky and sweet, the kind that made you feel like a kid again. Mikey asked, what now? Theo shrugged. Frankie said the car's got maybe 2 days left in her. 3 if we don't push it. Mikey looked out at the horizon. Think we'll find another town? Frankie smiled faintly. Don't need to. Theo watched the road unwind in front of them. He didn't feel anxious. Didn't feel lost. Just quiet. Later that day they came to a sign so faded it was barely readable. Mikey jumped out to clear the dirt off. When he did, the words came through. You were here. That was all. No direction, no town name. Just a gentle reminder. They laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it felt exactly right. Frankie said, sounds like a good final chapter. Theo nodded. Sounds like a place we already passed through. That night, they camped under the stars again. No fire. Just the car. The silence. And the hum of crickets that didn't care who they were. Theo opened the notebook again, and without needing to ask, he handed it to Mikey. He stared at the page, then wrote, we didn't get lost. We just took the long way home. The sun rose soft and orange behind them. No destination, no time to be there. Just the feeling that if they kept going, something would unfold. Not a revelation, not a reward, just clarity. The car's engine coughed once. Then again. Frankie kept his foot steady on the pedal. Mikey glanced at the dashboard. Gas gauge's been on E since yesterday. Frankie nodded. Sometimes you drive on grace. Theo smiled. And a little momentum. They passed an old drive-in theater. Just the rusted screen leaning like a tired shoulder. No sound. But Theo imagined the last movie that played there. Something with cowboys and black hats. Maybe something with a happy ending. They stopped the car in front of it, just to listen to the quiet. Frankie said, I brought a girl here once. Theo leaned forward. Mom? Frankie shook his head. No, before her. Mikey laughed gently. Did she like the movie? Frankie grinned. Didn't see a minute of it. The wind picked up in the afternoon. It scattered dry leaves across the road like messages written in a language only ghosts remember. Frankie didn't slow. He looked peaceful. Not because everything made sense, but because it didn't need to. By evening, the road turned gold again. Same way it had started. Theo felt something loosen in his chest. Not sadness, just the kind of stillness that says, you've done enough. He turned to Mikey, who had dozed off with his head against the window, hair catching the last of the sunlight. Then he looked to Frankie, eyes steady, one hand on the wheel, the other resting in his lap, fingers curled around a worn photograph. He didn't look at it, didn't need to. He just held it. And the road, faithful and fading, kept going. Not toward an end, but toward a softer version of goodbye. The car rolled slow now. Not because it had to, but because they did. Every few miles something would appear, a leaning fence, a half-sunk barn, a wheelbarrow turned to rust, ghosts of use, ghosts of purpose. Frankie pulled the Lincoln to the side of the road and killed the engine. The air was warm and still. Mikey stirred in the back seat. We stopping? Frankie looked forward for a long moment, then said softly, Yeah. They got out and stretched, boots pressing gently into the dry roadside grass. Theo wandered a few paces into the field. There were no buildings, no trails, just wind moving slow across the weeds like fingers through old hair. Mikey tossed a rock. It landed with a dull thud. Nobody followed it with their eyes. Frankie walked around to the trunk. Opened it. Inside were only 3 things. A red flannel shirt, the notebook, and a glass jar full of old coins. He picked up the jar, stared at it, then turned to Theo. These were hers. Theo stepped closer. She kept them for luck? Frankie nodded. No use for luck anymore, but I figured we ought to leave something behind. Together, they dug a small hole in the dry earth, not too deep, just enough to keep the jar safe from weather and time. Theo placed the coin he'd been carrying beside it. Mikey added the worn playing card, the Queen of Spades. Frankie placed the lid back on the jar and lowered it into the dirt. They covered it gently, stood in a loose circle around the small mound, and didn't speak. Back at the car, Theo sat on the hood, the notebook open on his lap. He stared at the last page for a long time, then finally wrote, What we left behind was never the weight, it was the shape of who we were. He closed the book, and didn't write again. That night they slept outside one last time. No fire, just stars. And the wind whispering through the tall grass, saying something too old to understand, but easy to trust. They drove through one more town. It didn't have a sign. No name posted, no welcome. Just a single stoplight blinking yellow over an empty intersection and the creak of a metal flagpole swaying in the wind. The diner's windows were boarded. The gas station pump had no numbers left on the dial. Still, they parked and stepped out like they had somewhere to be. Frankie walked into the post office. It was unlocked. Inside, rows of dusty mailboxes lined the walls. A few still had envelopes inside, sealed, faded, addressed in looping handwriting to people who no longer lived there. He didn't take one. He just looked at them, then turned and left. Theo wandered through what might have once been a school. Chalkboards still leaned against the walls. He ran a hand across one, left a clean streak behind. In the corner, a broken chair and a forgotten globe. He spun it once. It wobbled, then stilled, pointing at nowhere. Mikey sat on the steps of the general store, eating a candy bar he found in the glove box, left over from 2 towns ago. He shared half with a stray dog that had appeared out of nowhere and rested its head on his knee like it had known him a long time. They stayed for an hour, maybe 2. Didn't talk. Didn't take pictures. Then they got back in the car and rolled through the town's far edge like wind brushing through tall wheat. Frankie didn't look back. Neither did the others. Not because they didn't care, but because whatever they needed from the place had already followed them out. That night, they pulled off the road by a long wooden fence. The stars were so bright, it felt like the sky had cracked open. Frankie stood by the fence and rested one hand on the post. I used to think the road would take me away from everything I regretted. Theo joined him. Did it? Frankie shook his head. It brought me to you. Mikey leaned against the car and closed his eyes. And for a long time, nobody said anything at all. They woke to birds. Not many. Just one or two, high up in the wire branches above the car, singing not for company, not for joy, but simply because it was morning. Mikey stretched in the back seat. Theo rolled his neck and blinked the sleep from his eyes. Frankie was already standing by the fence line again, hat pulled low, watching the sky warm from indigo to blue. They didn't ask where they were going. That stopped being the point a long time ago. Frankie opened the driver's side door and sat with his hand resting on the keys. He didn't start the engine yet, just looked at the road, then at the notebook in Theo's lap, then at the two boys, and said, if we wanted to, we could turn around. Theo raised an eyebrow. You mean go back? Frankie shook his head. Not exactly. They drove a different way. Not back to any place they'd been. Not forward to something new. But sideways, through roads that looped but didn't trap. Over hills that felt familiar, though they hadn't seen them before. The world felt stretched. Like the edges of a story that didn't want to end but also didn't want to repeat itself. They found a field where wildflowers had taken over everything. Pale blue, soft purple bursts of yellow. A tractor rusted at the far edge, wheels sunken into the ground like they'd simply forgotten how to move. Mikey lay back in the grass, eyes closed, hands behind his head. Theo sat nearby, notebook open but pen still. Frankie stayed standing, hands in his pockets. He said, this might be it. Theo looked up. The end? Frankie shrugged. Close enough. Mikey murmured, feels like a beginning to me. They stayed until the sun began to dip. Then climbed back into the Lincoln, a little slower this time. The car didn't argue. Didn't complain. It started on the first try. And as they rolled down the hill, the flowers behind them waving goodbye, Theo finally wrote something in the notebook. The road didn't carry us anywhere. It just made sure we didn't stop too soon. The air changed again. Not the weather, the feeling. Like the road knew something they didn't. Like the silence in a church before the choir starts. They passed fields that had forgotten what they were for. Old fence posts leaned like tired men on bar stools. A mailbox stood without a house, the door hanging open like a mouth mid-sentence. Frankie drove slower now. Not because of the car, but because he didn't want to miss anything. Theo watched the clouds drift. They didn't move with urgency. They moved like stories being told for the second time, unfolding gently, without the need to impress. He pulled the coin from his jacket pocket. The compass etched on it had almost worn smooth now. Or maybe it always had been. He turned it once in his fingers, then slid it into the glove box. It didn't feel like something he needed anymore. Mikey had been humming again. A different tune this time, lower, slower. Not cheerful, but peaceful. Like the kind of song that gets passed down in kitchens and whispered on back porches. Frankie tapped the steering wheel lightly, keeping time. You write that one? He asked. Mikey shrugged. Maybe. Maybe it wrote itself. They found a town with no buildings, just the outlines. Foundations where houses once stood. Fireplaces left behind like tombstones. And trees growing up through old living rooms like someone had planted them on purpose. Theo stepped onto one of the stone floors and closed his eyes. He imagined a woman washing dishes where weeds now grew. A dog barking where vines curled up through a stairwell. He opened his eyes and whispered, somebody loved here. Frankie stood beside a half-collapsed garage. He looked at Theo and said, everyone did once. They didn't stay long. They didn't need to. Some places don't ask for stories to be added. They only want to be remembered. Later, they stopped at a creek with water clear enough to see the pebbles at the bottom. Frankie took off his boots, sat on a flat stone, and dipped his feet into the cold. Mikey followed, then Theo. None of them spoke. There wasn't anything left that needed saying. But after a while, Theo asked, "What's the last thing you ever wanted?" Frankie looked down into the water and answered, "Peace." Mikey leaned back against the bank and added, "I just wanted to know who we were without the road." Theo looked at them both and didn't say his answer, because it was already happening. They camped under a tree that night, not because they had to, because they wanted to. The stars blinked open one by one. No fire, no talking, just breathing, and the sound of old earth letting them rest. The morning came slow and blue. Mist hung low across the ground, blurring the line between earth and sky. The tree above them creaked gently, not from wind, but from memory. Frankie was the first to wake. He didn't stretch, didn't yawn, just sat up, stared into the fog, and listened. For what, he wasn't sure. But the silence felt like something had arrived. Theo stirred next. He sat cross-legged on his blanket, notebook in his lap. He didn't open it. He didn't write. He just looked at it, like maybe it didn't need one more line, like maybe it had always been finished. Mikey was last. His first words were, "Do we go?" But no one answered right away. Because the question wasn't about the car, it was about them. About whether they had reached the thing they weren't sure they were chasing. And somehow all three of them knew. Yes, the Lincoln sat parked beneath the mist. Still, quiet, as if it had done everything it was built for. And more. They packed slowly, without ceremony. Blankets rolled, coffee left uncooked, the notebook closed. Theo slipped it under the passenger seat. Not to forget it, but to let it rest. They walked, not toward anything. Just forward, along a path that didn't exist until they stepped on it. Through trees that had grown in spirals, past rocks shaped like questions. The sun rose behind them, casting long shadows that didn't look like three people walking, but one long shape, braided together, stretching out like the root of a single story. Hours passed, or maybe days. They didn't measure time anymore, just felt it. Like warm water, like sunlight through curtains, like the hush of a jukebox shutting down at the end of a slow song. They came to a place where the sky opened wide, wider than it ever had. And there was no more road. Just wildness. Space. Quiet and peace. Frankie stood at the edge and took off his hat. Theo let the wind press against his chest like a hand. Mikey whispered something into the breeze. No one asked what. Then, without plan or word, they sat down. Right there, in the grass, where the road ended or began or mattered no more. They didn't need to know where they were. They only needed to be. And far behind them, the Lincoln sat in stillness. Its keys still warm, its tires still dusted, its heart finally quiet. Not abandoned, just finished. Sleep stories, restless minds. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope the road was gentle and the rest came easy. Wherever you are, whoever you are already home. Good night.